All right. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about, if I get my chair to stop squeaking, we're going to talk about public opinion, what it is, why it matters, why we care about talking about public opinion in the study of politics. Just move me out of the way. Okay, so kind of what we'll be discussing is, again, what public opinion is, why it matters, where do we get public opinion, how do we measure it, and if or when it matters for governing. Okay. It's cold, so I'm wearing my hat and the jacket. This room that I'm in doesn't have very good insulation. So public opinion is basically just the aggregate, and when I say aggregate, I mean the combination or kind of bringing together of private opinions that individuals have, right? We all have all kinds of opinions about things, but when we talk about public opinion in the context of government, what we care about is our opinion about things that relate to government, to politics, right? Our opinions on our officials, on certain types of policy, be that healthcare policy, war, economic policy, things like that, right? Now, there's a few reasons why governments should hear out the people. The first is just because if they want to, it's prudential for them. If they want to get reelected, then there needs to be some connection, seemingly, or on its face, you would think that there needs to be some connection between the policy that people put into action, or that our representatives put into action, and what the people in this country actually want, or any country want, right? And that would make sense, right? Because seemingly, if they enact policy that people don't like, then they're not going to vote for them. We'll see if that's true or not. People don't really have very strong policy positions, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later. On a philosophical level, or kind of moving into modernity and democracy, another reason why public opinion matters is because governments derive their legitimacy from the people. At least that's how it's generally understood today in 2020, right? In most Western democracies, or most democracies across the world, we assume that the people are the ones who get to determine how they're governed, and that's important, right? We tend to think of government as being something that we control. Now, whether or not that's a philosophical issue, it seems to be that people tend to be most intimately knowledgeable about the things that they need. So, seemingly having a government based on popular sovereignty is going to give the people the best things, or give them the best opportunity to live a fulfilling life, at least according to their own wants and desires. So, where do we get our public opinion? Well, there's a few places that we get public opinion. We get it through this process of socialization. And socialization happens just basically anywhere where you're in contact with other people. So socialization is just that process of acquiring opinions and norms. Most people get it through their families, right? Conservatives tend to have conservative children, and liberals tend to have liberal children. Why? Well, because their parents teach them a lot, right? Your parents end up passing down a lot of information, and then the area that you live in is probably tied to the beliefs that your parents have. Conservatives tend to live in conservative areas, liberals in liberal areas, and those opinions, we are like sponges as kids. We kind of soak those things up. They form the basis of our kind of mental schema, the way that we interpret and understand the world. And then we take in those opinions, and sometimes those opinions we rarely question until taken in another context, be that college or high school or whatever. Group membership, school can be an important source of public opinion, though less important than family. Group membership, certain demographics groups tend to support certain political parties and certain policies. Religion, so like abortion, right? Abortion is a big topic among those who are concerned about, both those that are concerned about women's privacy and bodily autonomy, but also those who are concerned if they view a unborn fetus as a child or a fetus or what have you. The way that is interpreted is oftentimes based largely on religious beliefs. Okay. Now, socialization can also happen through political parties. Political parties socialize, but this is usually it usually starts at the family, and then you hear, okay, well, we're Republicans, and then you kind of vote for Republicans, seek out Republicans, and that kind of self reinforces. I mean, it's not like our parties don't have huge youth outreach. So it's not like they're like reaching out to you at every opportunity to get you to participate in politics. But it just happens through that general socialization process, which that socialization process is also where you tend to pick up your ideology. And ideology and party are not the same thing. You can think of ideology as like the beliefs and the lens that you interpret information, and the party is just parties have ideological bents. They have their own preferences and their own leanings, but they're not the same thing. A party is distinct from ideology. Parties might have ideologies, but they are not ideologies in and of themselves. Now, with that said, we'll talk about some reasons why Americans tend to be really unideological and what that actually means. Other sources of public opinion: experience. So this can be based on, if you're growing up in rural America, or if you are African American, or if you are Hispanic, or if you are wealthy, or if you are poor, right? These type of things will have influences on your opinions, right? Because rich people don't like to pay taxes. Poor people need social services. So this is going to influence their opinions about the things that the government ought to do. Okay. Generational effects. If you lived through a war, if you lived through a pandemic, right? What are your views? How do you think that government should respond to certain things? Okay. So, here's just some examples, right? So if we look at life experience and public opinion, so this is taken from Gallup poll in 1995, we can see that people who have had to put off medical care because it was too expensive believe at a higher rate than those who haven't that the federal government should increase healthcare spending. It's kind of interesting, but even those who haven't believe that to be the case. Those who attend church believe at a lower rate that prayer should not be allowed in schools. African Americans, Black people tend to believe that police have a lower set of honesty and ethical standards than do whites. Those who live in rural areas believe that handguns should be banned at a lower rate than those who live in urban areas where there's more handgun crime. Okay, so these things kind of break down demographically, as you can see. That doesn't mean that demographics are set in stone or anything like that. Demographic changes happen all the time, right? But with that said, they do tend to be pretty good predictors of public opinion in the aggregate, right? And you might say like, well, Black conservatives do exist. Yes, of course. Rich liberals exist. people defy expectations all the time. And that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is aggregated data. So some of you might say, well, I have differing opinion based on my belief. Well, again, these things aren't set in stone. These things are just looking at the data kind of broadly. This is what we tend to see. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this term that we use in political science called self-interest or rationality. Rationality in the context of any sort of social science is not the same sort of rationality that you would have if you're like a philosopher, right? Rationality in a social science context just means that you are self-interested and you have rank-ordered preferences, meaning that you kind of can order things in a list of things that you would prefer, and those things benefit you in some way or other. And that's a useful kind of construct to consider when doing social science, because we can assume a lot about individuals, right? We don't have to assume things like, oh, individuals are actively trying to do things that are against their own self-interest. No, we assume even a drug user, right, is getting some sort of benefit out of using drugs. So we can assume that they have a preference towards that, right? Now, a philosophical view of rationality would say, well, okay, there are things that are certainly disadvantageous and certainly harmful, and somebody can be acting irrational by choosing something that will harm them or harm others. That makes a lot of sense, but just for the context of studying political science and social science, we use rationality in this sense. The philosophical sense of rationality certainly makes more sense, I think, generally, because we can look and see, like, yeah, certainly there are things that are not particularly rational. In the social science sense of rationality, however, you really can't be irrational. Everything that you do is presumed to bring you some sort of benefit, even if that thing is self-destructive, right? It would just be like, well, you value heroin over like living, right? So that would be the way that the rationality as a social science construct would operate. So what are some problems with studying public opinion? Well, there's a whole host of problems with studying public opinion, especially when it comes to the problems associated with looking at political issues. And namely, that's because people don't have much political knowledge, right? I could poll, my first year students and ask them, some basic questions about politics, and the scores would be pretty poor. But even if you went to somebody who's, my age, and if I were to poll, say, my friends, and my friends were somewhat politically active, but if I were to poll my friends on how many members of Congress there are and how many Supreme Court justices there are and so on and so forth, adults in America tend to not do well on those. We don't know that much about politics, and that's because of something known as information costs. Information costs time. Sometimes it physically, it actually costs money. Like you have to spend money on education, on books. So information is costly. And a lot of people want shortcuts or just not even to worry about it because there's a whole, host of things that they'd rather be concerned with. So a lot of people aren't going to sink in the appropriate the appropriate amount of resources to actually become knowledgeable about politics. Another problem is that people tend to be non-ideological. What does that mean? Well, it means that their beliefs are not consistent, right? We would assume somebody who, for example, does not want to pay taxes, we would assume that that person also would not want to, say, have high levels of social services, right? Because social services cost money. All right. Well, what we end up seeing among Americans is that Americans don't want to pay taxes, but they also want high levels of social services. Well, something has to give there, right? We either have to pay taxes or we have to cut social services. We can't have both of them, right? This is something that happened under Trump, right? So Republicans have been complaining for years about the rising deficit. The rising deficit. Well, how do you pay for a rising deficit? You pay for it with taxation, right? And you can either cut services, or you can increase taxes, or you could do both. Well, what Trump did is decrease taxes, which led to an increase in in deficit spending, right? In increase in debt, right? So, and people, people don't want to pay taxes. That's understandable. It's money that comes out of your paycheck, but they also want things like social services. They want health care. They want roads. They want child care. All kinds of, the list goes on and on. So we're not particularly ideological, meaning that we don't have like a coherent set of beliefs that all kind of lines up together. Our opinions also tend to be highly variable, meaning that some people are very sincere and have high intensity about certain things, and then other things people don't really care about. Some people might not particularly care about an issue that's hugely important to you, right? Some people might care a whole lot about an issue that you particularly don't care about. Okay. Now, Americans tend not to have what are known as consistent policy positions, right? Those policy positions, if you ask Americans from one day to another, policy positions, if you ask them how they feel about a certain issue, they might change their mind from one day to the next. Americans do tend to have more solid candidate preferences, which is not a particularly good thing, because candidates can be a lot of smoke and mirrors, but not have much substance, when it comes to political opinions or political policy. Okay. Now, those who are highly educated and those known as issue publics tend to perform better. So these are basically people that are highly educated, or people who are highly vested in some sort of issue. Okay, they tend to perform better when it comes to political knowledge, being ideological. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are ideological. The less variable your opinions are, and the stronger your attitudes are as well. And we can look at this, kind of break this down. So if we look at how knowledgeable Americans are, this is from 1995. So 61% knew who controlled the U.S. House of Representatives. 62, around the same amount, knew who controlled the Senate. Only 34% could name the Senate Majority Leader. 53% can name the Speaker of the House. Only 60% can name the Vice President. Right? That's pretty remarkable. 6% can name the Chief Justice. And so on and so forth. We don't need to kind of belabor the rest of that, just that kind of point. But okay, so let's talk a little bit about ideology. So again, ideology are the set of kind of beliefs, or you can even think of ideology as being a little bit different than beliefs. Ideology can actually be kind of like the way that you interpret data, like when you hear something along the lines of something about I don't know, poverty, for example, where does your mind go first? Like, how do you think of solving an issue of poverty? What kind of intellectual baggage do you carry with you when you interpret certain data? Okay. So when you hear like poverty, do you think of like, oh, well, we need housing for people. We need substance rehabilitation. We need, so on and so forth, kind of progressive policies? Or does your mind immediately go to, oh, well, people need to work harder and they need to try to get jobs and things like that, kind of more conservative policy positions, right? So the way that you interpret that data would be considered your ideology. Okay, so you have on a liberal scale to a conservative scale, and this is kind of just a traditional old scale. Some people are using this kind of scale these days, which kind of breaks it down into authoritarian versus libertarian, economic right, which would be like more free market, to economic left, which would be more progressive policy, maybe more statist policies as well. Maybe statist is wrong. This kind of runs on a scale maybe from over here to like communism over here. Well, communism would probably be like up here, but this would be like socialist economic policy to right wing completely free market policy. This would be like communist, fascist, libertarian, and then this would be left libertarian or kind of democratic socialism. But again, people aren't necessarily ideological, right? So they don't necessarily have all their stuff clustered in one place or another, right? They might have their opinions kind of clustered across or spread across an entire spectrum, right? So if a person has these different opinions, how do we classify them, right? Well, you really can't say. You have to say that they're like pretty inconsistent. Maybe, I mean, I don't know. They're kind of right wing if you look at it, but maybe they've got some issue, particular love of the environment. Their dad took them hunting or something, but they also think that like tax policy, we should pay more taxes for some reason. But then they have right wing opinions on other things. But it's harder to do if people have diverse opinions and are not particularly ideological. Now, political scientists kind of consider two different types of opinion. They consider mass publics and political elites. So elites are, people that have political positions, who are either political positions or very wealthy or are highly educated. And the mass public tends to have a low level of connections between their political ideas. What does that mean? Well, again, we could go back to that example. So somebody who says, I want to pay no taxes and I also want high social services. Well, that's rational, right? Because you want all the benefits, but you want to pay in as less as possible. But it's not particularly ideological, because those two things kind of run contrary to one another. Now, what somebody might say is, I think that we need high levels of social services in this country, and as such, we recognize the idea that that has to come from a tax rate or from an increase in taxes. Okay. Or somebody might say, I believe that we should have low levels of social services and that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And as such, I believe that we should have low levels of taxation, right? Because we don't afford that. Those type of people would be ideological, right? Because they have consistent policy positions that kind of group them together in one of those sectors of that, of this kind of political compass that I've shown you guys. Now, even though individuals might not be particularly ideological, polls might still be meaningful. Polls can still be meaningful because they aggregate data. They take data and they slap it all together, and as such, you can kind of see like how people think in broad groups or as a whole, rather than looking at individuals. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we measure opinion. We poll people and we ask them questions. we'll kind of look at push polling is not like a legitimate form of polling, so we don't really need to talk about it. Except for push polling is kind of like push polling. I've gotten some things from like the Trump campaign that's like, um, do you support Donald Trump or do you support the radical socialist agenda of Joe Biden? Which is like, a verifiably insane thing to say. Like Joe Biden is far and away not a socialist, but the question is written in such a way to kind of like skew the person towards supporting Trump. Cross sectional polls are polls that are going to determine opinion at one point in time. A tracking poll, in contrast, is going to kind of track the opinion of a person over time to see if that opinion remains steady or if it changes. And if it changes based on, what, like certain data or what have you. Exit polls are used to kind of predict the winner of elections, and we'll see that coming up with the upcoming election. Now, some of the concerns that we have around polling are different types of errors. So sampling error, selection bias, and we'll kind of look at these each individually. So let's see. So sampling error. So sampling error comes from the difference between looking at a population, like a big group of people, and a sample. And a sample is the people that you actually polled, right? As pollsters, you want to know information about the whole population, right? We want to know what Americans think about healthcare. We want to know what Venezuelans think about Maduro. Okay, so we can't actually ask every person in that country, though. It's not very feasible. So what do? We poll them, and based on some theory and some math, some stats, you determine the size of your sample population. Okay, or I shouldn't use that term. You determine the size of your sample. Okay. Generally speaking, larger samples are better, but there are diminishing returns, right? If your sample is too small, you have a larger error. You have a larger margin of error when it comes to the likelihood that your sample adequately addresses the beliefs of your population. But once you reach a certain sample size, for every person that you add, you're not really adding any utility. You're not adding any benefit. So generally, our samples can be, anywhere from on the small end, somewhere along the lines of, 500 up to 5,000. But at a certain point, once you get to the point of like 1,000,000 people, it's not really much better than a sample size of say 2,500. Okay. There are also problems with what's known as selection bias. So selection bias can come from if you are making a mistake in the way that you are choosing the people in your sample. Okay, if for example, I go and pull a honors class at the honors college, and I ask them questions about. I went up to TCU and I said, "Hey, we're going to go into all the honors classes because these classes are usually pretty small, and we're going to ask them questions about their thoughts about TCU campus. Like, would that be a accurate description of the opinion of TCU students as a whole? No, because there are certain things that distinguish honors students from others, and that might be higher GPA, a whole host of different kind of qualities about a group that we have selected for erroneously. Okay, so selection bias, ways to get around selection bias. Right, if I went to a high school and I only polled, say the teachers, or only polled honors or AP classes, right, they would have a different answer than what the school as a whole would say. Okay. Now, a way that you get around that is through random sampling, right? Rather than choosing and making these selection biases or having a selection bias, you randomly choose people so that everybody has an equal opportunity of being, or equal probability of being chosen. Okay. Now, if you only care about certain groups, you can still randomly sample in subgroups with a stratified random sample. Now, certain types of polls are unlikely to produce representative samples. Right? If you use a internet poll, for example, from CNN or from Fox News, you're only going to get people that go to CNN or go to Fox News. Right? Those people are not going to have representative views of everybody in America. That's why those type of polls are scams. Right? Furthermore, it's just going to be people online, so you're going to miss all the olds that don't go online. Okay. Now, measurement error is kind of what you have that makes a poll not, or doesn't make a poll, excuse me. A measurement error is the error that basically prevents a survey from actually reflecting the actual opinion. There's a few ways that this can happen. One is if you use value-laden questions. So value-laden questions are questions that are leading you to answer in one way or another, right? And that's going to basically skew. You're going to have people's true opinions here, and then you're going to have the value-laden question kind of pushing people away from their true opinion. The questions could be too confusing or too simple. And if they're too confusing, people are just going to answer randomly or they're going to give up. If they're too simple, they're not going to be able to answer honestly, or they're going to be forced into answering something that doesn't quite actually pick up what their actual beliefs are. Sometimes even question order can lead to measurement error. Issue salience. Is the issue important to that person? If it's not important, then they can't really answer the question with a great deal of sincerity. So they might just kind of randomly choose something that seems the closest to it. Satisfying the questioner. And this is what you get a lot as a teacher, right? Students give me the answer that they think I want to hear rather than their actual opinion. So let's look at a couple examples. So what's wrong with this first one? Studies have shown that a college education helps boost economic performance later in life, and that universal attendance will go a long way towards reducing the income gap between privileged and traditionally underprivileged groups in America. Do you think we should be doing more or less to make college affordable for all Americans? Right? It's priming you. That's a value-laden question. That is a priming you to answer in the affirmative, that you should be doing more, right? Because look at all these great things. It's not getting your true opinion. Let's look at another one. In your view, is it or is it not impossible that recent immigrants would not prefer their non-home country to that in which they were born? Okay, so what's wrong with that? Well, that question is confusing as hell, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's got too many double negatives. It's got too many negatives, I guess, and it makes it really difficult to formulate what they're actually asking. Last question. Do you think women should be able to get an abortion should they want one? Yes or no? Well, people's opinions about things like this are much more nuanced, right? Very few people believe that somebody should be able to get an abortion the day before they are set to deliver, right? But many people believe that there are caveats and that women should be allowed to have abortions at certain times or under certain conditions, right? So that question doesn't really help much. It forces people into answering one way or another. So if we look, this is going back to salience. If we can look from, well, let me see if we can see the dates. I think it goes back to 2000 up to 2009 or so, or 2010. Like, what do people find important, right? So Um, in the midst of the Iraq War, a lot of people found that to be hugely important. Right, that's the most important thing between 2006 and 2008, up until the financial crash and up until the housing market crash, and the recession starts. Boom! Then the economy becomes hugely important. Right. So if you're asking questions about the economy when everybody else is looking at the Iraq War, they might not be able to answer your questions really honestly, because it's not even a matter of honestly, just like they might not be able to answer those questions well. But when the economy becomes salient, right here, okay, now people have opinions about the economy. Now people have opinions about what's going on. Okay, you can see that when it's almost, the recession starts about right here, maybe even going back a little bit, 2007, and then people start feeling the effects really heavily in 2008. So, how do politicians respond to these things? Well, politicians are crafty. They're smart. Let's not say they're smart. They're opportunistic. No, they're smart. They're smart in their own way, but they can be crafty. And they recognize polls for what they are, and they use them as a guide, but they cannot act in accordance with all of the polling data. Okay, they can do what their constituent wants, but oftentimes they don't even really want to focus on that, and they'll do things like this, right? Valence issues. Valence issues are contentless, really. They are issues that everybody supports and that nobody is going to really disagree with. Okay, here's a pedigree ad. We're for puppies, wet nose. Yeah, dogs rule. If most people like dogs. So this might not be the greatest valence issue. Some people might disagree. Some people might despise dogs, but a lot of people really like dogs, and it's not a hard issue to get behind. Right, so they'll support these big kind of amorphous concepts without very strong content, right? Make America great again, for example. Well, that's a valence issue. Right? What does that mean? What does that entail? It's a kind of catch-all, right? If Trump himself hadn't been so polarizing, Make America Great Again could have been, something that everybody in America can get behind, right? Why not? Why? Yeah, okay, that sounds good, right? It's kind of a big, kind of broad tent idea that most people can support unless you despise America, right? Which most Americans don't. So valence issues play big, and they're big for political campaigns. All right, so we are going to stop there. I hope this was helpful, and have a good one. Bye.